The radio crackled with barely controlled panic. Command, we have a downed F-16 behind enemy lines. Pilot critical. SAM sites active. Every asset we've sent is taking fire. The operations center fell silent except for the hum of tactical displays. Colonel Harrison stood rigid, his jaw working, his hands white-knuckled on the edge of the console. 7 hours. 7 hours since Captain Dane went down, and every rescue attempt had been beaten back by a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles that turned the valley into a death trap. "Get me any plane that can make that run," Harrison said finally, his voice tight. "I don't care what it is. Someone bring me options." The briefing room cleared like water draining. Pilots scattered to their squadrons, mechanics ran diagnostics, planners huddled over terrain maps. No one looked at the woman standing quietly in the back corner. No one ever did. Captain Lyra Keane had stopped expecting them to. She was 31 but looked younger, slight and unassuming with copper-red hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her flight suit was faded from 1,000 hours in aircraft. No one else wanted to fly. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. Slow, ungainly, older than most of the pilots on base. Lyra slipped out of the briefing room and walked across the tarmac as the sun dropped toward the mountains. The heat rose in waves from the concrete. Her boots made soft sounds against the ground, steady and measured. She'd learned to move quietly. It was easier that way. The A-10 sat in its revetment like a faithful dog waiting for its master. Weathered, battle-scarred. The titanium bathtub that cradled the cockpit bore scorch marks from missions no one remembered. The massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon formed the aircraft's spine, brutal and purposeful. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets and patches. This plane had been her father's once. Colonel James Keane killed 12 years ago when his Warthog took a direct hit covering a Marine extraction. They'd given her his wings and his call sign at the funeral. Havoc 6. She'd worn both quietly ever since. "You planning to just admire it? Or you got a mission?" Master Sergeant Hale appeared from beneath the wing, grease-stained and skeptical. He was the only crew chief who'd volunteered to work with her after she'd been assigned to the A-10 squadron. Everyone else wanted the new fighters, the fast movers, the glory birds. "Shh, shh," Lyra said quietly. "Hostile territory. Shh. Say M threat." Hale's eyebrows rose. "They clear you. They will." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded and ducked back under the wing. "Give me 40 minutes. I'll have her ready." Lyra walked back to operations. The building buzzed with controlled chaos. 2 F-15 pilots stood by the mission board, their flight suits crisp, their confidence absolute. Major Kent and Captain Rivers, both had tried the run. Both had turned back when their radar warning receivers screamed missile lock. "It's suicide," Kent was saying. "Those SAMs have overlapping coverage. There's no approach vector that doesn't light you up." Colonel Harrison's office door stood open. Lyra could see him inside, on the phone with someone higher up the chain. His face was drawn, the weight of Dane's life pressing down on his shoulders. She waited until he hung up. "Sir, I can make that run." Harrison looked up, his expression flickering through surprise, confusion, dismissal. "Captain Keane, I need combat-capable aircraft. We're looking at F-15s, F-16s. The A-10 can do it." Kent's laugh cut through the room. "The Warthog? That thing tops out at what, 350? The SAMs will track you like you're standing still." Lyra kept her eyes on Harrison. "Low and slow, sir, under their radar envelope. The terrain provides cover if you know how to use it. The A-10's built for exactly this kind of environment. Built 30 years ago," Rivers interjected. "Sir, with all respect, we need speed and countermeasures." "Not that." Harrison rubbed his face. Dane had been his wingman once, years ago. The clock was ticking. Every hour decreased the chances of recovery. "Keane, I appreciate the initiative, but my father flew this mission profile in Desert Storm." Her voice was quiet but carried weight. 5 successful extractions from hostile territory using terrain masking and the A-10 survivability. He documented everyone. I've studied them. I've trained for them. The room went silent. Harrison stared at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived on base 6 months ago. She was steady, calm, not pleading, just stating fact. You really think you can do this? Yes, sir. Kent shook his head. Colonel, this is Major. You've made your opinion clear. Harrison's voice was sharp. He turned back to Lyra. You have one shot. If your radar warning receiver so much as chirps, you abort. Understood, sir? She turned and walked out before anyone could object further. 40 minutes later, Lyra sat in the cockpit running pre-flight checks. The A-10's instruments were analog, mechanical, honest. Nothing digital to fail. Nothing fancy to malfunction. Just steel and titanium and a gun that could chew through a tank. Hale's voice crackled through her helmet. Havoc 6, you're green across the board. Hydraulics solid, cannon loaded, countermeasures full. Go get him. Copy, Sergeant. The twin turbofans spooled up with their distinctive whine. The Warthog rolled forward, ungainly on the ground, heavy and purposeful. Lyra ran through her mental checklist as she taxied. Terrain features, enemy positions, extraction coordinates, weather patterns. Every variable her father had taught her to account for. The tower cleared her for takeoff. The A-10 lumbered down the runway, picked up speed with aching slowness, and finally lifted off, not soaring, rising. She turned toward the mountains. The valley lay 50 miles north, carved deep into hostile territory. Intelligence had mapped 3 SAM sites in a triangle around Dane's position. Any aircraft approaching from altitude would be bracketed and destroyed. The F-15s and F-16s had learned that the hard way. But Lyra wasn't going high. She dropped to 200 feet above ground level, following the contours of the terrain. The A-10's wings flexed slightly with the turbulence. The world blurred past rock faces, scattered trees, the burned-out hulk of a tank from some forgotten war. Her radar warning receiver stayed silent. Lower. She took the Warthog down to 100 feet, then 50. The ground screamed past beneath her. One mistake here would be instant death, but the terrain radar on those SAM sites couldn't track her this low. The mountains themselves were her shield. The valley opened ahead of her like a scar in the earth. She could see smoke rising from Dane's crash site. 5 miles in, the SAM sites would be active, scanning, waiting. Lyra's breathing was steady, measured. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. The Warthog doesn't fight like other aircraft. It doesn't run, it stalks. She banked left, following a dry riverbed that cut through the valley floor. The walls rose on either side, narrow enough that her wingtips almost brushed the stone. Her altitude read 30 feet. She was flying through a canyon at 300 miles per hour with barely enough room to maneuver. The crash site appeared ahead. Dane's F-16 was crumpled against a hillside, one wing torn off, the canopy shattered. She could see movement. He was alive. But 200 yards west, SAM battery tracked across the sky, searching. Lyra pulled up, gained 50 feet of altitude, and triggered her smoke generators. Gray clouds poured from her wingtips, obscuring the A-10 as she circled. The SAM battery swung toward her, but the smoke and low altitude confused its targeting. She keyed her radio. Dagger 2-1, Havoc 6. Stay low. I'm coming to you. Dane's voice was weak but clear. Havoc? Who? How? Sit tight, Captain. She brought the Warthog around in a tight orbit, using the terrain and smoke to stay unpredictable. The SAM site fired. A missile streaked skyward, tracking on radar ghost and heat bloom. Lyra punched flares and banked hard right, dropping back into the riverbed. The missile lost lock and corkscrewed into the valley wall. 2 more SAM sites activated, their radars painting her from different angles. They were trying to triangulate, to box her in. Lyra armed her cannon. The Gauntlet Avenger was designed to kill tanks. It fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds at 4,000 rounds per minute. The recoil was so powerful it could stall the aircraft if fired too long. It was brutal, devastating, precise. She acquired the Western SAM sight on her targeting computer, pulled up into a shallow climb, steadied, squeezed the trigger. The Warthog shuddered as the cannon roared. The sound was apocalyptic, a deep tearing bellow that echoed off the valley walls. Tracer rounds streaked toward the SAM battery. 30mm rounds punched through armor plating, shattered electronics, detonated fuel cells. The battery exploded in a fireball that rolled skyward. Lyra banked hard, pulling 7 Gs, the aircraft groaning under the strain. The northern SAM sight fired. She dropped chaff and dove back toward the ground, following the terrain so close her landing gear almost scraped rock. The missile passed overhead by 50 feet and detonated against a cliff face. She circled back toward Dane. The third SAM sight was trying to acquire her, but it couldn't get a clean lock. She was too low, too erratic, using every fold in the terrain to break line of sight. Dane had dragged himself out of the wreckage. He was waving, limping, his flight suit torn and bloody. Lyra couldn't land, the ground was too rough, but she could provide cover while extraction birds came in. Her radio crackled. Havoc 6, Rescue 7-3. We're 2 minutes out. Can you keep them off us? Affirmative, 7-3. Stay on my vector. The third SAM sight swung toward the approaching helicopters. Lyra didn't hesitate. She pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, exposing herself to draw fire. The SAM battery locked onto her. Missiles away. She counted 3 streaks rising toward her. Flares. Chaff. Hard bank. The first missile lost track and tumbled. The second passed so close she could see its exhaust. The third was tracking true. Lyra inverted the Warthog and dove straight toward the SAM site. The missile followed. She held the dive, the ground rushing up, the targeting computer screaming warnings. At 300 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The cannon roared again. Rounds hammered into the SAM site, tearing it apart. Lyra pulled up at the last possible moment, the Hephaestus crushing her into the seat. The missile, unable to follow the tight turn, impacted the wreckage of the battery she'd just destroyed. The combined explosion lit the valley floor like a sunrise. The helicopters swept in low and fast. Rescue crews jumped out, grabbed Dane and hauled him aboard. 40 seconds. They were airborne again, rotors clawing at thin mountain air. Havoc 6, we have the package. You are cleared to RTB. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She circled once more, checking for threats. The valley was quiet now. Smoke rose from 3 destroyed SAM sites. Dane was safe. She turned south toward home, the A-10 carrying her through the mountains as steady and reliable as ever. The base appeared on the horizon as the sun touched the western peaks. Lyra brought the Warthog in for landing, the gear thumping down onto concrete. She taxied to a revetment and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was profound. When she climbed down from the cockpit, a crowd had gathered. Pilots, crew chiefs, operations staff. They stood in a loose semicircle, watching her in silence. Colonel Harrison stepped forward. His expression was complex shame, respect, something close to wonder. Captain Keane. His voice carried across the tarmac. I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you from the start. Lyra pulled off her helmet. Her hair was plastered to her head with sweat, her face streaked with exhaustion. You gave the order when it mattered, sir. That's what counts. Kent appeared from the crowd, his earlier arrogance gone. That flying... I've never seen anything like that. How did you know? My father taught me. Simple. True. She didn't elaborate. Hale was grinning as he walked around the A-10, checking for damage. 3 SAM sites. 3. And you brought her home without a scratch. Dane arrived an hour later, his arm in a sling, his face bandaged but alive. He found Lyra in the ready room, filling out her after-action report. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. They said a Warthog pulled me out. I thought they were joking. Lyra looked up. How are you feeling, Captain? Alive. Because of you. He stepped into the room. I heard the recording. You took on 3 SAM sites in an A-10. That's impossible. No, just requires knowing the aircraft. She returned to her paperwork. Dane studied her. You're James Keane's daughter. It wasn't a question. Lyra nodded. I read about him at the academy. The legend who flew Warthogs into places fast movers wouldn't touch. They said he was the best Psi-S pilot who ever lived. Dane paused. I guess it runs in the family. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm, heavy. She'd spent so long being invisible that recognition felt foreign, uncomfortable, but not unwelcome. Thank you, sir. Colonel Harrison called her to his office the next morning. The base commander was there, a stern woman with silver hair and 3 stars on her collar, General Pemberton. She'd flown in overnight specifically for this meeting. Captain Keane, Pemberton said. Your actions yesterday were extraordinary. You demonstrated tactical brilliance, technical mastery, and courage under fire. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Lyra stood at attention, her face neutral. Thank you, ma'am. More than that, Harrison added. I'm requesting you be transferred to lead the A-10 training program. We've neglected close air support doctrine. That changes now. You'll teach the next generation everything your father taught you. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. Legacy. Responsibility. Recognition she'd never sought but had earned through action. I'd be honored, sir. Pemberton smiled slightly. There's one more thing, your call sign, Havoc 6. It meant something when your father carried it. Now it means something again. You've earned it in your own right. That evening, Lyra walked out to the flight line one more time. The A-10 sat in its revetment, the setting sun painting its gray skin gold. Hale was there running post-flight maintenance, his hands gentle on the aircraft that had brought them both home. She did good, he said without looking up. She always does. Lyra climbed into the cockpit one more time, not to fly, just to sit, the seat molded to her body like an old friend. Her father had sat here once, in this exact position, looking out at the same mountains. He'd faced impossible odds and met them with skill and courage. She understood now what he'd been trying to teach her all those years ago. It wasn't about the aircraft. It wasn't about the medals or the recognition. It was about showing up when it mattered. About trusting your training in your aircraft and yourself. About doing the job that needed doing, whether anyone was watching or not. The A-10 wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. It wasn't what anyone wanted until suddenly, it was the only thing that could do the job. Lyra smiled in the fading light. Just like her. Word spread through the base and beyond. The story of the Warthog pilot who'd taken on 3 SAM sites and won. Of the captain no one had noticed who'd done what the best pilots and the best aircraft couldn't manage. Within weeks, transfers were being requested. Pilots wanted to learn from her, to understand how she'd done the impossible. Lyra taught them the way her father had taught her, patiently, thoroughly, with respect for the aircraft and the mission. The A-10 program, once neglected and scheduled for retirement, found new life, new purpose. 6 months later, when another pilot went down in hostile territory, it was a Warthog that brought them home. And another 6 months after that. And again. The legend grew. But Lyra stayed the same. Quiet. Focused. Teaching each new pilot that competence doesn't announce itself. It simply performs when called upon. Colonel Harrison retired 2 years later. At his farewell dinner, he raised a glass and told the story one more time. Of the day he'd asked for any plane that could make an impossible run. Of how he'd hesitated when the smallest, quietest captain on base had volunteered. Of how that hesitation had almost cost a life. I learned something that day, he said, his voice carrying across the room. The flashiest aircraft isn't always the right one. The loudest pilot isn't always the best. Sometimes the answer is standing quietly in the corner, waiting patiently for someone to ask. Captain Keane taught me that. I won't forget it again. Lyra sat at a back table, uncomfortable with the attention as always, but she raised her glass with the others. For her father, For the A-10. For every pilot who'd ever been overlooked and kept flying anyway. The Warthog remained in service. Not because it was fast or new or glamorous, but because when the impossible needed doing, when lives hung in the balance, when terrain and threats and circumstances conspired against success, the A-10 and pilots like Lyra Keane showed up and got the job done. Havoc 6. The call sign her father had made legendary. The call sign she'd carried quietly into battle and brought home in triumph. The call sign that would inspire a generation of pilots to trust their training, respect their aircraft, and never underestimate the power of quiet competence. In the end, that was the only recognition that mattered. Not medals or ceremonies or stories told at retirement dinners, but the knowledge that when someone's life depended on it, she'd been ready, capable, unshakable. Just like the aircraft she flew. Built for purpose, not for show. Designed to endure, to protect, to bring people home. The A-10 and Captain Lyra Keane. Two legends cut from the same titanium cloth. Both overlooked, underestimated, and absolutely essential when the moment demanded excellence. The colonel had asked for any plane that could make the run. He'd frozen when the A-10 answered. But he'd learned. They all had. Sometimes the best answer isn't the loudest or the fastest. Sometimes it's the one that's been there all along, waiting patiently in the corner for someone to finally ask. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.